The restraints hit the floor. The Alpha King's eyes followed her wrist, then everything in him locked. That mark wasn't enemy blood, wasn't a trick, wasn't a lie. It was his mate's mark, burning on a prisoner he was supposed to execute, and the next choice would either destroy his rule or damn her forever. If this story gripped you and you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Don't let algorithms steal what you actually enjoy. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Let's build this community together. Subscribe. Now, before you scroll past and forget, the iron restraints had left marks on Lyra's wrists. Faint indentations where metal had pressed against skin for days, weeks perhaps. She had stopped counting after the interrogations blurred together. The stone chamber was cold in the way only northern architecture could be, designed to remind prisoners that warmth was a privilege, not a right. She lowered her hands slowly, deliberately, aware that every movement would be analyzed for weakness, for deception, for any sign that could be used against her. 23 years of conditioning had taught her how to read those in power. The Southern realms believed education meant memorizing orders, not understanding purpose. She had been trained as a political instrument, not a person. Raised to infiltrate, to observe, to report, to obey without question. But standing in that chamber, wrists finally free yet still utterly captive, Lyra understood something her trainers had never intended her to learn. Systems that rely on obedience fear consciousness more than rebellion. Because rebellion can be crushed. Consciousness cannot. The Alpha King watched her with eyes that saw too much. She recognized the assessment, the calculation. He was deciding whether she was worth keeping alive. What he didn't know was that she had already seen the moment his composure fractured. The instant his gaze caught the mark on her wrist. The second he realized what it meant. Biological bonds do not erase power imbalances. They complicate them. And now the real interrogation would begin. The guards had stepped back when Kael gave the order. They knew better than to question him, though confusion flickered across their faces. Restraints were rarely removed during initial interrogations. Control was the currency of information extraction. "Leave us," he said. His voice carried the kind of calm that made disobedience unthinkable. The chamber emptied. Silence settled like snow. Lyra stood motionless, wrists still bearing the shadow of iron. She didn't rub the marks. Didn't flinch. Didn't perform relief. The absence of reaction was itself a message. I know you're still watching. Kael circled slowly, the way predators assess territory. He was looking for tells, tension in the shoulders, unconscious favoring of one side, the micro-expressions that betrayed training. What he found instead was discipline that mirrored his own. She had been shaped by someone who understood that information flows both ways during interrogation. "You were sent to gather intelligence," he stated. "Not a question. I was sent to follow orders." Her voice was steady, factual. "And now? Now I'm here." Kael stopped in front of her, close enough to invade the space hierarchy demands between captor and captive. Close enough to see the faint scar above her left eyebrow. Close enough to notice when her gaze controlled, measured, dropped instinctively to her own wrist. That was when he followed her line of sight. The mark was subtle. Old, not fresh. A pattern that looked almost like a burn but moved with organic precision across her inner wrist. The kind of mark that appeared only once in a werewolf's lifetime. The kind that signified, no. Kael's breath stopped. Not metaphorically. Physiologically ceased as his autonomic system registered what his conscious mind refused to accept. The mate bond he'd felt shatter 8 years ago when blood and fire had taken everything, surged through his chest like a wound reopening. His vision narrowed. Sound became muffled. Memory fragmented and reassembled wrong. Her laugh, her hand in his, her scream cutting through the night before silence swallowed everything. But she was dead. wasn't she? The woman before him wasn't moving. She was watching him with the same careful stillness, but now he saw something else beneath it. Recognition. She knew what the mark meant. Had known before he did. You should sit down, Lyra said quietly. The suggestion from prisoner to king should have been absurd. Instead, it was the only thing keeping him upright. Because if he acknowledged what his body already understood, if he named what the bond was screaming through every nerve, then everything he had built since that night would become a lie. And Kael Raverin could not afford lies. Not about this. So he did what leaders do when beliefs are threatened. He froze the reaction behind training. The interrogation will continue tomorrow, he said. His voice sounded distant even to his own ears. Guards will escort you to a cell. You will not be harmed. He turned toward the door, each step deliberate, measured. Professional. Inside his chest, the bond howled. The cell was smaller than the interrogation chamber. A single window, too narrow for escape, let in pale morning light that made the stone walls look almost silver. Lyra sat on the edge of the cot, running her thumb across the mate mark on her wrist. She had known what it was the moment it appeared 6 months ago. The Southern Realms had extensive records on bond formations, not for celebration, but for strategic exploitation. Mates made alphas vulnerable. Vulnerabilities could be weaponized. They had sent her here because of it. What they hadn't anticipated was that she would feel the bond too. That it would wake something in her chest that had nothing to do with orders or loyalty or the mission they'd carved into her bones. But feeling it didn't make her safe. If anything, it made her more disposable. So she had said nothing in that chamber. Let Kael think she was ignorant, compliant, waiting to be told what this meant. Truth spoken too early to someone with absolute power was just another way to die. Kael stood before his counsel, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested control he didn't feel. The prisoner remains detained pending further interrogation, he said. She's Southern Realm, Counselor Theron said, his voice clipped. The protocol is clear. Execution or exchange. Not detention. I will determine protocol. The silence that followed was heavy. Kael could feel their assessment, the way they watched for cracks in his authority. They had followed him through wars, trusted his discipline, his restraint. But trust in leadership was conditional. It required predictability. And nothing about this situation was predictable. Is there intelligence she possesses that justifies the delay? Another counselor asked carefully. That, Kael said, is what I intend to discover. He dismissed them before they could ask the questions forming behind their eyes. Later, standing outside Lyra's cell, Kael stared through the small window in the door. She sat perfectly still, expression neutral. Compliant. But he had seen her eyes during the interrogation. She wasn't submitting. She was surviving. The bond pulsed in his chest, not romantic, not comforting. Insistent. Demanding he acknowledge what his mind still rejected. This woman was not his to command simply because fate had marked them both. The bond gave him responsibility, not ownership. And that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. The council chamber felt smaller than usual. 7 counselors sat in a semicircle, their faces carved from stone and expectation. Theron stood, a scroll of precedents unrolled before him like a weapon. 17 cases, he said. 17 instances over 3 generations where enemy operatives were detained. All 17 resulted in execution or exchange within 10 days. This is not cruelty, Alpha. This is law. Law written during wartime, Kael said evenly. We are still at war. The other counselors murmured agreement. Kael watched them, men who had served his father, who had shaped the kingdom's spine with iron and tradition. They weren't cruel. They were terrified. Change looked like weakness when you'd spent decades believing strength meant never bending. The prisoner dies, or we lose credibility, Counselor Marin added. The northern clans need to see strength, not hesitation. Kael's jaw tightened. And if strength requires us to repeat the same cycles indefinitely? Silence. She remains detained, he said finally. That is my decision. Theron's expression darkened. My lord, precedent exists for a reason. Without it, leadership becomes arbitrary. Chaos. Or, Kael said quietly, tradition that survives only through fear is already dead. He left before they could respond. Lyra was standing when he entered her cell, as if she'd been expecting him. They want me executed, she said. Not a question. Yes. And you're here to tell me you can't protect me. Her voice was calm. Factual. That politics matter more than, she stopped herself. Kael stepped closer. More than what? Than whatever this is. She lifted her wrist, showing the mark. You think I don't know what it means? That I haven't spent 6 months understanding I'm bound to someone who might have to kill me anyway. The bond flared between them. Not gentle. Demanding. You could let me go, she continued. Send me back. Pretend you never saw it. That would be easier. But you won't. No. Lyra met his gaze. Killing me won't make you free, Kael. The use of his name, unadorned, unpermitted, struck something loose in his chest. He had been Alpha King for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be just a man facing an impossible choice. He turned toward the door, then stopped. You will not be executed, he said. I don't know what comes next. But not that. It was the first time he'd hesitated as Alpha. And somehow, it felt like the first honest decision he'd made in years. The new quarters had windows. Real ones, with glass and iron lattice, overlooking the northern courtyard. Lyra stood at one now, watching crowds gather below. They weren't celebrating. Southern whore, someone shouted. Others joined. The words blurred together into a single pulse of hatred. 2 guards stood inside her door. Not restraints, Kael had said. Protection. But protection that required permission to leave a room was just imprisonment with better furniture. She understood what she'd become, a symbol. Not a person, a projection screen for every grievance, every loss, every fear the northern clans had accumulated over generations of war. They didn't know her name, didn't care about her story. She was just the enemy made visible, and visibility made her an easy target. Populations always needed someone to blame. Systems that failed their people rarely survive scrutiny. But a foreign prisoner? That was simple. Safe. It redirected rage away from the leaders who perpetuated cycles they claimed to oppose. Kael found her still at the window 3 days later. I can arrange your departure, he said quietly. Safe passage to neutral territory. You'd be free. Lyra turned. Free to run. Free to hide. Free to let everyone believe whatever story serves them. She shook her head. That's not freedom. That's erasure. They want you gone, Lyra. My counsel. The people. Staying puts you in danger. I know. She moved away from the window. But if I leave silently, nothing changes. They'll find another enemy. Another symbol. The cycle continues. What are you suggesting? Let me speak. Publicly. Kael's expression shifted. That would threaten your control. I know. Because voices disrupt hierarchies built on silence. She met his eyes. But you already disrupted it by keeping me alive. Now you have to decide, am I your prisoner or am I a person? The announcement came the next morning. The southern prisoner would address the court. The council erupted. Half demanded her immediate removal. The other half demanded Kael's. Outside, border scouts reported increased southern realm activity, troops mobilizing, supply lines activating. War was coming. And Kael had just given the enemy a platform inside his own walls. But for the first time since the bond awakened, he understood. Protection without voice wasn't mercy. It was just control wearing a gentler mask. The great hall fell silent when Lyra entered. Every eye tracked her movement to the center of the chamber, not as prisoner now, but as something undefined. Dangerous. Kael stood at the head of the council table, his expression unreadable. "Speak," he said. Lyra's voice was steady. "The Southern Realms didn't send me to spy. They sent me to be caught." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I was raised in their training compounds. Not educated, conditioned. We were taught that loyalty meant obedience without question, that doubt was treason, that our value existed only in service to the state." She paused. "They knew about the mate bond before I crossed your border. They've known for months." Kael's hands tightened on the table edge. "How?" Theron demanded. "Because they've been tracking bond formations for decades. Studying them. Suppressing them." She turned to Kael. "Your mate didn't die 8 years ago. She was taken. The bond was severed artificially using blood magic rituals designed to make you believe she was dead. They needed you hardened. Isolated. Grief made you the weapon they required to justify their own militarization." The chamber erupted. Kael said nothing, his face drained of color. Lyra continued over the noise. "I was activated when the bond reformed. Sent here so you would either kill me, proving you're the monster they claim, or keep me, which fractures your authority. Either outcome serves them. Because authoritarian systems don't fear strength. They fear leaders who evolve." The war horn sounded before dawn. Southern Realm forces had crossed 3 borders simultaneously. The fracture within Kael's court had been their signal. Division meant vulnerability. Kael stood on the ramparts, watching distant fires bloom across the horizon. Beside him, Lyra waited in silence. "They used both of us," he said finally. "Yes, the bond is real. That's why they feared it." She turned to face him. "Bonds can't be controlled, only manipulated." Below, his army assembled. Behind, his council demanded decisions. The bond pulsed between them, no longer just biology, but choice. Kael addressed the gathered forces, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "The woman beside me is under my protection. Not as prisoner. Not as possession. As someone owed truth we were both denied." The declaration wouldn't stop the war, but it changed what they were fighting for. The Southern Realms Declaration arrived by messenger at dawn: return the stolen mate, or face annihilation. Kael read it twice. The language was deliberate. Stolen implied kidnapping, made Lyra property, turned him into villain. They'd weaponized the bond they'd tried to destroy, transforming it into justification for invasion. "They're giving you an exit," Theron said carefully. "Send her back. Claim ignorance. The war ends before it begins." "It doesn't end," Kael said. "It pauses. They'll find another justification, another symbol. This was never about her. Then what do we do?" Kael looked toward the window, where Lyra stood watching troops assemble in the courtyard. "We tell the truth. They're using me as an excuse," Lyra said when he approached. "You could end this by hiding you, sending you away, pretending the bond doesn't exist." Kael shook his head. "I've spent 8 years letting others define what strength means. Building authority on certainty that was always a lie. The council will see it as weakness. Let them." He moved to stand beside her. "I'm tired of choosing between appearing strong and being honest." Lyra studied him. "If you name the bond publicly, there's no taking it back. Your enemies will use it. Your allies will question you. Everything becomes harder." "I know." "Then why?" "Because," Kael said quietly, "you were right. Killing you wouldn't make me free. But neither does hiding you. Freedom isn't the absence of bonds, it's choosing which ones matter." The announcement was made from the ramparts at midday, where both armies could hear. "The woman you demand is my mate," Kael's voice carried across the battlefield. "Not by theft. Not by force. By a bond neither of us chose, but both of us acknowledge. She is not property to be returned. She is not a symbol to justify your wars. She is a person who deserves agency you denied her, truth you manipulated, and choice you never permitted. Silence fell across both sides. This war was never about her, Kael continued. It was about control. About leaders who fear change more than death. I will not participate in that system anymore. The Southern forces didn't retreat. But the nature of the conflict had shifted. It was no longer North versus South. It was transformation versus stagnation. And that was a war worth fighting. The battle was not glorious. Wars rarely are, despite what songs claim. What unfolded across the northern plains was calculated, brutal, and efficient. Kael's forces held defensive positions, refusing to be drawn into the aggressive expansion the southern realms expected. This wasn't conquest. It was boundary enforcement. Violence, Kael had learned, was not chaos. It was organized failure, the moment when every other option had been exhausted or ignored. 3 days into the engagement, cracks appeared in the Southern Command. Messengers were intercepted carrying orders that contradicted public justifications. Soldiers began questioning why they were fighting for a mate bond their own leadership had tried to destroy. The propaganda collapsed under scrutiny. By the 5th day, the Southern general requested parley. Kael met him in the neutral ground between armies. Lyra stood beside him, not behind, not hidden. Visible. Your presence here violates protocol, the general said, eyes on Lyra. Protocol built on lies, she replied calmly. You know what they did. The blood magic. The suppression. You were there when they trained me. The general's jaw tightened. He turned to Kael. If we withdraw, what guarantee do we have you won't pursue? None, Kael said. Accept my word that this territory remains defensive. I have no interest in expansion, only in refusing systems that manipulate bonds for political leverage. And if our leadership demands we continue, then your soldiers will have to decide whether they're fighting for leaders who lied to them or for something that actually matters. The Southern forces withdrew by week's end. Not in surrender, in fracture. Their command structure collapsed as lower ranks demanded accountability for the manipulations exposed during conflict. Kael didn't pursue, didn't claim victory, didn't expand borders. He simply held the line. Lyra stood on the ramparts as the last enemy battalions disappeared beyond the horizon. They'll rebuild, she said. I know. This isn't over. No. But the cycle is broken. What they rebuild won't be the same thing. Kael looked at her. Because now their people know the truth. That changes everything. Borders remained intact. But ideologies, North and South both, had been fundamentally shaken. And that mattered more than any territory ever could. 3 months after the withdrawal, Lyra stood before the council, not as prisoner, not as symbol, but as herself. You have options, Kael had told her the night before. Stay. Leave. Define your own role here. Whatever you choose, it will be respected. For the first time in her life, the choice was actually hers. I want to establish communication channels with the Southern realms, she said now, addressing counselors who still watched her with wariness. Not diplomacy. Not yet. But dialogue. Between people who've been used by systems that fear connection more than war. Theron frowned. That could be seen as threatening. I know. Lyra met his gaze steadily. But isolation is what created this conflict. If we want different outcomes, we need different approaches. Kael nodded. Approved. The council shifted uneasily. But no one challenged him. Governance changed slowly. Kael introduced accountability measures, councils that could question decisions, systems that invited dissent rather than punishing it. Not revolution. Evolution. Some counselors resigned. Others adapted. The structure remained, but its foundation shifted from dominance to responsibility. The bond between Kael and Lyra existed, undeniable and permanent. But it wasn't the fairy tale people expected. Some days it was comfort. Other days it was tension. They argued, disagreed, challenged each other. It was real. And reality didn't require perfection to matter. Lyra found Kael on the ramparts one evening, watching the border. Still worried, she asked. Always. He glanced at her. Peace isn't an achievement. It's a practice. It requires constant attention. Like the bond. Like everything worth keeping. She stood beside him as twilight deepened. The borders were quiet, but not empty. Watchfires burned on both sides, not threatening, but present. Aware. You know what I've learned? Lyra said quietly. What? Power unexamined becomes tyranny. Trauma unexamined becomes tradition. She looked at him. And leadership begins where fear ends. Kael smiled, rare, genuine. Where did you learn that? From an alpha king who chose truth over certainty. The bond hummed between them. Not destiny. Not fate. Choice. And in the end, that was the only thing that had ever mattered. Peace was fragile. Incomplete. Conscious. But it was theirs. And they would build it one decision at a time. The chains fell. The bond awakened. Two enemies discovered that destiny doesn't write endings, choice does. Kael and Lyra proved that power without accountability becomes tyranny, and true leadership begins where fear ends. Want more stories that challenge power and deconstruct destiny? Subscribe now for narratives that don't just entertain, they transform. New chapters. Deeper themes. Real lessons. Hit subscribe. Your next revelation is waiting. The Alpha King chose truth. What will you choose?